Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our program, Tribal Nations, Climate Change, Adaptation, Planning, and Resilience. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Cary Library Foundation and the Lexington Field and Garden Club for co-sponsoring this event. I'd also like to thank Native Americans in Lexington Climate Action Network, which is LexCan, the public libraries in Ashland, Bedford, Beverly, Brookline, Dedham, Marlborough, Needham, Newton, Somerville, Tewksbury, Wakefield, and Wayland for partnering with us on this event. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A and Dr. Thornbrugh will answer them at the end of the program. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Dr. Casey Thornbrugh is a citizen of the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe and is a geographer with a background in climate science. He has served as a Tribal Climate Science Liaison for United South and Eastern Tribes Incorporated, which is USET, in coordination with the Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Climate Resilience Branch and the Northeast and Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Centers. In this role, he worked with agencies and departments of tribal nations to provide climate science information, identify climate research needs and priorities, and offer climate adaptation planning support. Dr. Thornbrugh served as a co-author of the 5th National Climate Assessment Northeast Chapter. He resides in Mashpee, Massachusetts, with his wife Sarah and their 2 children. Dr. Thornbrugh, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to the Cary Memorial Library and partners for invitation for being here. Winnie Wonok, Natasuis, Casey Thornbrugh, Gan Thomas Masipia, Nukas Asuisu, Cheryl Green, Ka Nush Asuisu, Curtis Thornbrugh. Again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'm going to be giving this presentation on tribal nations leading the way in climate change, adaptation, and resilience. Just to speak a little bit about this picture here, this is a picture from a tribal climate resilience camp, which I held at my former place of work at United South and Eastern Tribes back in the summer of 2022. And the organization USET, it is a organization that works extremely hard to provide technical support and advocate for the well-being of tribal nations and communities. This shirt was from one of our staff members participating in the camp, and it says, resist, speak up, stand up, rise up. Your ancestors and your people are depending on you. And this is a thought I carry with me every day, and that many of us do that work with our own communities or with tribal nations across the country. Okay, just change slide. There we go. Okay. So just introduction, this is my family. I wanted to share this because I'm here because of them. And to the upper left is my mom, Cheryl Green, and she's Mashpee Wampanoag and raised and grew up in Mashpee. And my dad, Curtis Thornbrugh, born in Central City, Kansas, and grew up and raised in Kansas, but came to Boston and came to Massachusetts and met my mom, and there I am as a little me right there. The center is my wife Sarah and our 2 children, Mariana and Celia. It's about a year old, that picture, so they're a little older now. They're both completely mobile toddlers moving around. And this is a picture. My wife serves on the Conservation Commission for the town of Mashpee. And this was actually the date of her swearing in. So a really special day for our family. The next picture in the top right is my sister Shauna and her my nieces, her children graduating. They are now students at Tufts University. Really proud of them as well and the work that they're doing. The bottom left is my mom's dad, my grandfather, the late George Green. He's someone that I learned quite a bit about Wampanoag history or through his experiences growing up in Mashpee. And then the bottom right is my uncle Chucky Green, and that's my mom's brother. This picture is of us when I worked as the director, and my uncle Chucky worked as the assistant director for the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe, our tribal nation's natural resources department. Those were very special years. I actually grew up away from Mashpee, which I'll talk a little bit more coming up in the next couple of slides. But I came home as an adult, and the first thing I did was to work for my own tribe in the Natural Resources Department. And I learned a lot about our community and history and a lot of what we call, traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, from my Uncle Chucky Green. So my interest in geography and climate started from childhood. And as I was saying, I was born in Massachusetts, but my mother worked with a lot of tribal organizations and communities across the country. So we moved around quite a bit. We did end up moving and living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is probably the longest place I lived in my childhood. So from age 10 until college. My mother worked with the National Indian Youth Leadership Project, which is based in Gallup, New Mexico, but does programming for tribal youth from across the country. As we did different camps and programs and traveled around, this is to date myself back in 1990, so I'm 10 years old there. I was really into maps. And so these road atlases and things we would use before all this fancy technology that we have today, to get places and to find places, I would be basically in the backseat of the car reading these maps and really enjoying it. Furthermore, these road atlases behind on the last few pages of them, they actually had climate information about different places, the climatological averages. And I read them so much, I began to almost memorize them. And it was just very interesting to me. One of the greatest gifts my family gave me was this weather almanac, which also, it says weather almanac, but it actually has long-term climatological information from so many places across the US. Again, memorize them. And I started drawing my own lines on them. That next figure there is a page of sea surface temperatures, or average sea surface temperatures by month in the Atlantic on different points up and down the East Coast. So I started really studying climate as a child and being very interested in it, even before the knowledge of or awareness of climate change became much more public. So this is our homeland from satellite, and I love this picture. So we call ourselves Wampanoag, and that means when we say the East, Wampanoag, Wampanoag is basically saying like those, the people of the dawn, the people of the first light. Our language, the Wampanoag language, is part of the Algonquin language family, which is one of the largest indigenous language families on the North American continent. But it's similar. There are many languages up and down the East Coast, but many are part of the Algonquin language family. And so when you go north and you have tribal nations and communities such as Penobscot or Passamaquoddy, they are referred to themselves as Wabanaki, or as my former boss would share, Wabanaki, also with the same meaning, those of the Dawnland. So we're the first peoples on the continent to see the sunrise. Historically, those who would refer to ourselves as Wampanoag, lived in the space. We still do to this day, but prior to colonization, there was probably on the order of about 69 to 70 known villages. in this space. And you can kind of see the outline of Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, the islands. You probably see Boston there too. This is an area, if you include the water, it's about 4,000 square miles. And this is an area where our language was spoken. Colonization and land dispossession and wars and disease as well had some very severe impacts on Wampanoag. And today we have two federally recognized Wampanoag nations and a few other Wampanoag communities in Massachusetts, but not as large as population wise as we were, say, at about 1,600. So my own tribal nation community is the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe. It's located in Mashpee, Massachusetts, which is the town name. Our original name for it is Mashpee, and it refers to a very large freshwater pond, the Mashpee Wakeby Pond, which is one of the largest freshwater lakes, and I think the largest by volume of water on Cape Cod. And our language, Masipi, we're saying, great waters or large waters. And so this refers to like our place. We have a very long history in this place. Ourselves and other Wampanoag tribes, we have been here at least 12,000 years, or at least back to the last glacial maximum. I'll talk a little bit more about that coming up in our observation of climate. But in the history of Massachusetts, following impacts from disease and wars, there remained a few tribal communities many referred to as praying Indian towns, for which Mashpee was one. Through various agreements and for us asserting our sovereignty, we've been able to maintain, despite challenges in history, and to continue as a tribal nation today. We have a citizenship of, last I understand, we're just about over 3,000 tribal citizens now. Just probably a little under 1,000 live within Mashpee, but many of our tribal citizens also live in other parts on Cape Cod or in Boston or New Bedford. But our cultural core is Mashpee. We have traditional forms of government. We have a traditional chief. We have medicine men. We have medicine people throughout our community, but the chief and medicine man also serve on our tribal council. Tribal council for us is like Congress. It's like the legislative branch of our tribal nation community. We have an executive branch as well. So that's our tribal chair and vice chair. And we have a judicial branch as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that, how that's similar for other tribal nations, why that's come to be. But we work closely to have forms of government that are very similar to what you see, say, in the United States, but also maintaining our traditional forms of governance alongside of that as well. So I'm just going to give a little overview of tribal nations to kind of set the stage here, and as we get into climate impacts and adaptation. Currently, there are 574 tribal nations in the United States, including Alaska, that have federal recognition. In addition to that, there are other tribal nations and communities that are recognized by the respective states for which they are within. There's a little over 60 of those. Many of those are in the East. When we look at tribal lands and jurisdictions, of course, we look at it as like, the whole North America, all of Turtle Island is the homeland of someone's community or tribal nation or indigenous culture. But when we look at areas where we have like direct jurisdiction, such as American Indian Reservation and trust lands or Alaska Native village and corporation lands. We're looking at about 119 million acres. That's about 4% of the US land base. And this map kind of shows where those spaces are. On the 2020 census, there were about 9.7 million people that identified as American Indian or Alaska Native, and that's in combination. So within that, those are people who identify as American Indian, Alaska Native alone, or people that, and I should say, people who identify as American Indian, Alaska Native, and another, with according to census, like race, African American, or other, or so on and so forth. However, it's really important to understand that tribal nations and our citizens, we have a more political relationship with the United States. So when you talk about things about race, our relationship is more of a political one than one of like where you see like ethnicity and race and things like that. Granted, we share tribal nations, like a tribal nation will share ancestry, and you probably and all its citizens have the ancestry belonging to that tribal nation, but each tribal nation is a little different in its criteria in citizenship. And part of that sovereignty is for a tribal nation to decide who is a citizen of that tribal nation. But again, our relationship is more political. So honing in, because this is Carey Memorial Library in Lexington area, I thought I'd hone in on Massachusetts. Massachusetts has two federally recognized tribal nations, the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe and the Wampanoag Tribe of Gayhead, Aquinnah. Previously, back in 1970s, there was Executive Order 126, which provided the state recognition, but through long hard work and testimonies, the Wampanoag Tribe of Gayhead, Aquinnah, got federal recognition in 1987, and the our tribal nation, Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe, got federal recognition in 2007. There are two state recognized tribal nations communities as well. Nipmuc Nation, also from the 1970s executive order. And then more recently, Herring Pond Wampanoag Tribe, also near in Plymouth near Cape Cod. There's 6 additional communities listed by Massachusetts Commission on Indian Affairs that are shown here. I want to point out just on the map too. So Chappaquiddick Wampanoag Tribe, there's Chappaquiddick on Martha's Vineyard. There's also an office in Boston. And so that's why the arrow is kind of pointing in that direction as well. And then this map shows also where the ancestral original territories of different tribal nations and cultures in Massachusetts are. Last thing I'll say about this map is there are tribal nations such as the Mohican and Stockbridge Munsee, whose homelands are in far western Massachusetts, such as the Berkshires and into the Hudson River Valley, who were dispossessed of their lands right around the time after the American Revolutionary War. And their communities were forced to move out west. Today, there's a Stockbridge Munsee tribal nation that's federally recognized. It's in Wisconsin, and they actually have established a tribal historic preservation office in Western Massachusetts, and that's really a cool thing because it's their homelands, it's their original homelands, and so being able to have a presence in there is very important. There's probably a little over 50,000 Indigenous American people in Massachusetts. And when I say Indigenous American, that's in addition to tribal nations and communities in Massachusetts, but also citizens from other tribal nations outside of Massachusetts, whom they and their families live in Massachusetts, and as well as people from Indigenous nations and cultures from beyond the United States, from Central and South America, that are in Massachusetts as well. And that number actually may be significantly higher. So tribal nations are Indigenous nations that predate the United States. And this is very important because, we sometimes think of ourselves as, we know ourselves to be the First Nations or the first countries of this place. These two maps are maps of language families. And so, of course, on the left is the Eastern US, and then on the right is Europe. And what I wanted to demonstrate was our cultures and language families are just as diverse as in any place in the world. Um, and like I was mentioning earlier, Wampanoag is a language within the Algonquin language family. We have Haudenosaunee, which used to be more referred to as Iroquois, completely different language family, but also in the Northeast, and within it, distinct languages. And so I like to look at these maps together because when you look at like Europe, you kind of see how the language families, evolved into the nation states, or into the countries that are more familiar to geographers today. And if you were to map that out in the United States and kind of remove the state boundaries, what our lands would look like on a cultural landscape. And so, um, again, our nations are very old. They're the First Nations, and refer to them as tribal nations here in within the United States, and then more often the term is First Nations in Canada. So we do have to mention and discuss, the challenging topics, and that's the colonization and land dispossession, which we tend to look back to 1492 to present. Um, Again, historically, all of this, Massachusetts and then this country, um, was the land of indigenous nations and communities. And it's not so much land, it wasn't originally land ownership, but it was more like land connection. The land is us and we are the land. And there's a lot of studies on like where we came from and how we evolved. But if we look at language and we use our language like Wampanoag, for example, it's not spoken anywhere else in the world. That language grew and evolved here in this place, and it's the only place in the world where you're going to have that language. And that same can be true for other tribal nations and tribal cultures and their languages. Um, so as the United States expanded, the land dispossession occurred sometimes violently, uh, sometimes with minimal violence, but with the threat of violence. And tribal nations have treaties, and there are uh, over 500 treaties across the United States where uh, tribal nations or particular tribal nations sign treaties with the United States. And again, sometimes it might have been related to war or might have been to prevent a war. In most cases, it's where a tribal nation was making a decision for the best interest of its people. And if that meant ceding lands or or being forced to move to a different area, that is reflected in the treaty. Um, and so we have, like I said, back to like 4% of land base and direct jurisdiction in the United States. Many tribal nations, I will mention, are working very hard on like land rematriation, and whether it's lands that are donated back or tribal nations have to purchase these lands. Um, my tribal nation has kind of done that kind of hopscotching around and being able to return lands and then put those lands into trust status for now and for future communities. As this was happening, we did see and observe where Native children um, being forcibly removed from families and sent to what were called Indian boarding schools. And this happened in Canada too, and also the United States. Places and times where speaking your original tribal language was forbidden and punishable. And the attempt was to force out our language and force our culture out with hopes that the United States would see us disappear. We'd still be around, but we wouldn't have our culture and language. And that was really devastating. And when I tell people about this, it's a really difficult subject. And I say, okay, well, imagine if it were English. Imagine if, you know, you were told that you couldn't speak English or your kids couldn't speak English and your kids were taken away because they were speaking English. And they're forced to learn a different language and to stop speaking English. And then they come back and you try to talk to them, or they have grandkids and you try to talk to them and it is difficult and it's traumatizing. And so tribal nations have been dealing with this. And so I talk about it 1492 to present. A lot of this is historical, but we see these things come up again in various versions. In 2020, the administration, Trump administration of that time, and the Department of the Interior under that administration tried to abolish our tribe's reservation, and that's 2020. That's fairly recent. And there's discussion now, and if you watch the news about, the United States trying to acquire Greenland, which granted it's a part of Denmark, it is self-governing still, and it's 89% indigenous, mostly Inuit. So we're seeing this continue to happen, and this is why we have to talk about it. We try to learn from history so we do not repeat it. So what does this all mean with relationship? And that's why I said tribal nations have a political relationship with the United States. And we have inherent sovereignty. So sovereignty is not given to us. It's something we had originally, and we have to fight very hard to maintain. So this is from an educational handbook from United South and Eastern Tribes. It's available online, and you can learn more about it. But in the gist, it gives it, and it states basically what happened and why we have a trust and treaty obligation. And it's that tribal nations ceded millions of acres of land and natural resources to the United States. It was often involuntary or out of necessity to prevent the killing of our people as we sought to protect our families, our homelands, and way of life. These ceded lands and natural resources are the very foundation of the wealth and power that the United States and many of its citizens enjoy today. In this exchange, the United States made promises that exist in perpetuality to ensure Native people's health, overall well-being, and prosperity. And this exchange is the basis of the trust and treaty obligation that the United States federal government as federal agencies have to tribal nations and Native people. So as I said, tribal nations are inherent sovereigns with governments and agencies. Populations and sizes of tribal nations vary, but it's very often that, when you have a tribal nation with its tribal government, it may have like a natural resources department or environmental protection department, or police department or education department. And those are the agencies. Those are the agencies responsible for those services respective to that tribal nation. And so whether that department has a staff of 30 people or 3 people, it's nevertheless the agency responsible for that is tribal nation. And so, like I said, you'll have tribal nations that have their own education school districts. My tribal nation example is we have our police department, and we have our own Office of Homeland Security. So it's very important to know. And I like to show this figure to everyone because in geography and civics education, students learn a lot about the federal government and state governments and then local municipalities. But a lot of times, tribal nations are left out or only mentioned only a little bit. And this is shown as like a triangle to demonstrate that it's important to know all 3 American families of governments, and these are in the Constitution. So there's the federal government, states that have some limited sovereignty, but also the tribal nations, which also have sovereignty. So the punchline of this is in education, just as it's important to know federal government and be aware of states and where they are, it is just as important to be aware of tribal nations, where tribal nations are, and that tribal nations also are governments and are inherent sovereign governments within the United States. Higher education is also very important. And so we have many students who go in, Native students who are in higher education and go through all kinds of institutions, 4-year colleges, community colleges, across the board. But there are also tribal colleges and universities. Those started as tribally controlled colleges and universities in the late 1960s, starting with Navajo Community College, which is known as Diné College now, until today. Today, there are about 38 or so tribal colleges across the United States, mostly in the Midwest and West. There's been discussion, there's often conversations and thoughts about tribal college, establishing tribal colleges in the East. But we have many citizens of tribal nations in the East that travel out West in the Midwest and attend tribal colleges. Tribal colleges, many are 2-year, but some are 4-year, and some even offer graduate programs. And some are almost all receive some level of federal funds, but you do have tribal colleges like Haskell, Indian Nations University, and Southwest Indian Polytechnical Institute that receive a majority of the funds from federal funding. And so what we're seeing, and I'll talk a little more later, the impacts or freezes in federal funding has been impactful in tribal colleges. Last thing I'll say of the importance of tribal colleges is that tribal colleges are also the place where students and faculty and staff and community are doing the research and doing the work on climate change adaptation in tribal communities. So that was a semester's worth. Try to compact into about 20 or so minutes of tribal nations. Now we'll go get right into climate and kind of hone in here in the remaining 15 minutes so we have some time for questions. So tribal nations, especially our nation being here for thousands of years, we've experienced climate and changes in climate since time immemorial. My particular community and other tribal communities in the Northeast witnessed the glaciers and the glaciers receding. We witnessed things like isostatic rebound, or where the land bounces back after a heavy glacier recedes, but also where the sea level comes back up and fills in. When these glaciers were at their maximum, sea level was 300 to 400 feet lower than it is today. So places that are underwater to the south of us, like George's Banks, were exposed land. Back in the last glacial maximum, and our ancestors lived and on that land. So we witnessed these, and a lot of these are seen in our stories. We have many interesting and epic stories, our creation stories, our traditional teachings. And like I said, they're quite epic. And when we have like youth programs and we share some of these stories, some of the stories you share, like, wow, it's hard to believe something like that would happen. But we have to remember that people who have lived here for thousands of years and ancestors that have lived here for thousands of years saw some epic climate and geomorphological changes that had front row seats to it. And a lot of these changes are shown through stories, and that's part of our indigenous knowledge. When you look at our community and you look at tribal communities and cultures across the country, traditional architecture, building homes and other facilities match the climate. When you look at the Pacific Northwest, or when you look at the Northeast, cedar is a common material, and cedar is more rot resistant, and it makes a lot of sense to use it in damp climates. When you look at the northern and southern plains, you're looking at high fluctuating temperatures and winds, and also cultures that need to be mobile. And so that's where you have like TP, and its design is perfect for that location. When you get to the southern areas in the southern plains, you see earth lodges and places where the wind goes up and over, and it makes a lot of sense for that place. In the Southwest and in the Southeast, places that can get very hot in the summer, architecture that keeps the interior cool, or in places like South Florida, or in Seminole Miccosukee homelands, where you have ventilation and air moving through. So traditional architecture makes complete sense in the climates. Our foods come from the places and climates for which we live in. And so when you look at the traditional foods that we eat, it's critical that the beings, crops, and wild plants that grow in these spaces are able to thrive, so we can continue our foods and we can continue our culture that's connected with these foods. So some of the impacts we've been seeing for decades now, like I said, we've witnessed climate change, changes in the climate over millennia, but what's happening now is the anthropogenic climate change at a much faster rate. And the impacts from colonization and land dispossession means that we have smaller land bases to have our communities hang on to. So if these land bases are impacted, we have limited options. And those are some of the challenges in terms of moving around or adjusting to changes. These pictures show coastal communities are especially impacted. We have in Alaska Native communities or Isle des Jean Charles and other indigenous communities on the uh, uh, Gulf Coast. You have sea level rise at such dramatic rates and places where people cannot live anymore. The far picture on the far right is Quinault Nation on the Pacific Northwest coast. And this is just a nuisance tide. So it's not like a storm, it's just higher tides. And so they've luckily the past couple of years acquired funding to relocate their entire community. And you have to think about how much that actually costs because you're moving houses, you're moving schools, you're moving infrastructure to higher ground. In the east, we have other impacts. Wildfire, we have to think about. A lot of folks look to the west and say, that's where we have some of our largest by acres wildfires. But with changing climate and longer drought and dry periods in the east, we have to think about wildfires as well. That's a picture of the Gatlinburg fire in fall of 2016, which was one of the largest and most devastating fires in the East. And it occurred over in Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians homelands. As we see increasing rainfalls, especially occurring in the Northeast, any land surface pollution or nitrogen on land is washing out into local freshwaters and estuaries. And estuaries, it's such a challenge because that's where our traditional foods come from, shellfish and others. And so we've had periods after heavy rains where we cannot harvest in these because of contamination. And we're seeing more of that occur in recent years. And then warming oceans. Warming oceans is changing the distribution of species or beings that which we have a relationship to and that are a part of our food systems. So I won't go through each and every bullet for the sake of time, but a couple key ones is that tribal nations are uniquely impacted by climate because of our connection to place. And that our food systems, ceremonies, and economies are heavily reliant on the ecosystems of that place. So we're seeing a lot of these climate change related events and impacts, and our relationship with the federal government is really important, and because the fulfillment of the trust obligation is where the federal government has the inherent responsibility to ensure the protection for tribal environmental and cultural resources that support tribal sovereignty and self-determination, and if those resources are being impacted by climate change. So we started talking about climate change a long time ago, and as was mentioned, I am a co-author on the 5th National Climate Assessment. The first National Climate Assessment was issued or came out in the year 2000, and it's by law under the U.S. Global Change Act of 1990. It's supposed to come out every 4 years. It took about 10 years for the first one to come out, but they were just kind of getting it up and going. But one of the things that occurred was a convening in Albuquerque, New Mexico, from NASA and GCRP representatives and tribal nations from across the country to talk about what the observations of climate change and its impacts were in communities and to document that. So I was 18 years old during this. This was, a really long time ago, and we've been speaking about this for such a long time. This information was included in the assessment. Now, a chapter dedicated to indigenous peoples and tribal nations didn't come out until the third assessment. But in each assessment since then, we have a dedicated chapter to climate change impacts and adaptation and for Indigenous peoples and tribal nations and communities. This is just some of the what I like to call Indigenous climate champions, and these are many of these people I had the great fortune of working with in my life and in this work. There's the American Indian Alaska Native Climate Change Working Group, which we had our first meeting at a tribal college at Haskell Indian Nations University, convened by a professor there, Mr. Daniel Wildcat, shown on the top left, and we had some researchers, we had citizens from tribal nations, we had citizens that are also researchers, such as the late Oscar Coagley's UPIC from Alaska. That became the Indigenous Climate Change Working Group and rotated its meetings and work amongst tribal colleges. The Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Community Resilience Program has been ongoing for over 10 years now, providing support and resources to tribal nations and communities for adaptation to environmental impacts and planning. And then Rising Voices, which includes Indigenous peoples from tribal nations, but also Pacific Island as well. Unfortunately, earlier this year, their funding was cut, and that's been a very difficult thing to contend with. Also wanted to mention Dr. Carletta Chief on the top, Dene, hydrologist and professor, working real hard with tribal communities, including her own, on adaptation to environmental, including climate. And the late Merv Tano, who was a mentor for many of us working on adaptation and planning. So tribal nations, as sovereign, inherent sovereigns, and with agencies, began tribal or climate vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans. And this occurred all across the country. And today there's about 70 or so tribal climate adaptation plans or vulnerability assessments across the country. In the Northeast, the Akwesasne, also known as the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe, was one of the first tribal nation to formally publish climate adaptation plan. It came out in 2013. Their plan is very unique, and it's culturally based, and so they use their Thanksgiving address as each chapter or section in the plan, which has different aspects in the environment that are critical to Mohawk and other Haudenosaunee nations, and they build upon that, how each section is impacted by a changing climate and what they're going to do about that. Shinnecock Indian Nation also has came out with a climate vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan in 2013 following Superstorm Sandy. And then we have other tribal nations or intertribal organizations, such as the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, that came together to do adaptation plans. And some of them start with language, with, in this case, Anishinaabe, looking at different beings or species impacted by climate change in the Great Lakes area. We've seen the development and implementation of culturally responsive tribal adaptation resources. And when I say culturally responsive, we see climate adaptation planning like at state governments, municipal governments, and also federal agencies have been working with that in communities across. But from a tribal perspective, there's many things that are unique to a particular tribal nation or tribal nations and communities, especially things like language or traditional foods. And so the Bagan Jigadig Anishinaabe Ejitwad, that's my Anishinaabe, which been working on for a little bit, but it's focused on tribal adaptation planning in Anishinaabe or Ojibwe communities in the Great Lakes region. This has been such a successful approach that this has been taken to other tribal communities beyond Anishinaabe country and homelands. So we've had presentations given in the Northeast and even in South Florida as well, or attendees from tribal communities in South Florida. Another approach is the East Coast Indigenous climate adaptation frameworks, and this one in particular is called the Wampum Adaptation Framework. Wampum is a very important cultural item for us Eastern tribal nations. It comes from the quahog shell, and we have it in our jewelry. We also have it in stories. It's also in wampum belts for treaties and family histories. In this, it's shown as an acronym for Indigenous-based climate adaptation. And there's a paper on this written by Dr. Kelsey Leonard, who's a citizen of the Shinnecock Nation. And she and her lab pulled these concepts together. So it talks about using your culture and your values to adapt to a changing climate. And in the most challenging of situations, if your community has to move, you do so under your control, like you make the decision. And also a place that you may have to move from that becomes, say, maybe inundated from sea level rise, you do not relinquish your cultural relationship to that. That is still your space, and still part of your tribal homelands or seascape. So that's a very important part of this. Back in my time working at USET, we provided many trainings, and including adaptation technical support, such as working with tribal nations and helping them complete their adaptation plans, doing writing retreats for tribal staff that were working to complete their adaptation plans. We did this in person and virtual, especially during the pandemic when everything was virtual, and then tribal climate resilience camps for tribal staff and on occasion tribal leaders who would also attend these camps. This is a picture of a tribal climate resilience, tribal climate camp. This concept was really started in the Pacific Northwest. Again, it's a culturally responsive climate workshop using tribal knowledge and values as a baseline. And this idea spread throughout from the Northeast, and we started holding them in the East. We had our first virtual one in 2021, and then in person 2022. This picture is from a tribal climate camp that we did in North Carolina back last summer. And so staff come with concerns and projects and deliverables to work on during this week, and we provide staff support to assist. So when they return to their tribal agencies and communities, they are further along in their adaptation planning. Many tribal nations also have climate action plans, doing an assessment of greenhouse gas emissions and how to reduce those. So in Massachusetts, the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe and Wampanoag Tribe of Gahedaquina both have been working on climate action plans. And so I'm going to speed up because of the time here so I can finish up. But I did want to mention this is that we have tribal nations that have been working hard across the country on removing obsolete dams. Many fish that are diadromous and travel through the oceans and into river systems, such as river herring or in the Northeast, Atlantic salmon, have been inhibited by these dams. And so the Penobscot Nation, working with partners such as Nature Conservancy being one of them, were able to remove several obsolete dams in the Penobscot River and start to receive the return of alewife and Atlantic salmon. And by doing this, the climate is still changing, but you're giving these beings and species a chance. When species are constrained, the impacts are going to be greater. Also having Indigenous leadership and management of offshore areas and marine protected areas. There is the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary, which has been established recently, where Chumash nation communities and representatives serve as a leadership role in the management of this marine sanctuary. And that is very important to continue to do. Tribal colleges, again, mentioning, putting out educational materials, and even like for young people in comic book fashion, talking about climate change and environmental change, but using language, our Indigenous language, both that and English. So I'm going to conclude here and just say we have many challenges, especially this year. These federal freezes have been very impactful, in some cases devastating, with leading to layoffs of employees in tribal colleges and in communities, or the prevention of hiring key employees that will be essential for climate adaptation planning. Like I said, tribal colleges have been especially impacted, especially those receiving a large amount of federal funds. So where do we go from here? It's very important at the local level for partnerships and to support tribal initiatives to continue adaptation to climate change, and to, you know, vote and be involved locally and in your state, and even that, to support folks that support the U.S. Trust and Treaty obligation to support tribal nations and protecting our resources and communities. Ways to help. It's important to learn about and be informed on tribal nations in your area. Make sure the information that you're getting is from official tribal government resources or tribal nonprofits or federal programs that do work with tribal nations and communities, or state Native American affairs offices as well. And like I said, make sure the folks at local, state, and federal levels are supporting the U.S. Trust and Treaty obligation of tribal nations. It's important to advocate for more tribal law and policy and indigenous histories to be part of American K through 12 education, and to advocate and support tribal nations and tribal agencies to be leaders in climate resilience and adaptation policy development and decision making. So I think this, I'm gonna close this. This concludes. Share here for a moment. I was going to just share my screen here and have my last screen with my contact information, but that's okay. I can share that and just say Katapatanamu for those who came on and are part of this presentation. And thank you again for the invitation. I'm going to take some questions, and I believe we have, first check the Q&A and see if we have some questions there. Okay, so we had some also questions come in, and I'm going to start with this one. Question is, can you share an example of a particularly innovative and effective adaptation strategy you've seen implemented by an East Coast or coastal tribal nation? And yes, there are many examples, but two I want to mention right off the top of my head are Shinnecock Nation on Long Island. They're basically at sea level. The highest part of their community, they're on a peninsula, and the highest part of their community is about 20 feet above sea level. The periphery part of the coastal areas, they've seen impacts from sea level rise. They've been working to restore their shoreline and use natural materials to do so. So extending the beach out, restoring and repairing dune, sand dune and beach grass environments, and putting out natural barriers to wave that would increase erosion. They also have oyster reefs that they've established, and oysters part of their traditional foods as well. So they're really applying that wampum adaptation framework in protecting their shoreline using natural features. The Wampanoag Tribe of Gehedaquina, in a similar fashion, they are also right on the coast or have lands right on the coast, and they've been building their dunes, replanting beach grass to protect infrastructure. They have some roads that were initially at risk to sea level rise and flooding, and cutting people off because they were certain access points. So they've been working and bringing their tribal citizens and communities on these regular beach planting and monitoring the health of these restoration of dune systems, which are like the natural protection for storm surge. So it says so. Thank you for the comment on the presentation. Thank you very much. The question is, are there any land back programs or indigenous management in Massachusetts yet? And there is. There are tribal nations that are doing this, but there's also an example of the Native Land Conservancy, or NLC, which is based in Mashpee, but works with not just Wampanoag, but other tribal communities in Massachusetts, and protecting lands for conservation, but conservation from indigenous perspectives. So it's protecting lands so that tribal citizens can go to these lands, can fish, can gather, can do ceremony, can do other culturally important activities on these lands. So they're actively doing that, throughout the state, and also working with tribal communities in other parts of the U.S. They're the first native or indigenous land conservancy east of the Mississippi. So definitely look them up. They're exceptional in the work that they do. So another question is, what do you see as the top climate concerns of tribal nations in Massachusetts? So good, sea level rise is an important one. Like I said, some tribal nations and communities have infrastructure right on the water, but even if infrastructure is not on the water, places of cultural significance are on the water, or places where our people go to hunt, fish, gather, are places that are on or near the water. Um, Also, I think, I do think that we also need to be mindful of drought and wildfire risks. Again, we haven't seen in recent years the number of acres and epic wildfires that have happened out west, but when you take Cape Cod, for an example, and pitch pine and oak woodlands, these are fire ecosystems originally. And so our people burned these areas, uh, you know, to restore them, actually. And when the English colonists first came over and wrote in their diaries, they actually wrote in their books and observed us doing these traditional prescribed burns. These burns do bring back plants and restore in their low level, slow burning. Um, and they also reduce hazardous fuel load buildup, and that would fuel catastrophic fire. So I think our tribe has, in partnership, done prescribed burns around our tribal community. And I think it's important just to be paying attention to reducing wildfire risk, especially in Massachusetts as well. Okay. So this one came up, and this is moving, so I'm so sorry if I skip any, but are there culture museums? Yes. Both the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe and the Wampanoag Tribe of Gehedaquina both have cultural museums. You can go on the respective tribal websites, and learn more about them, and check on their hours and visitation. I believe there are other tribal museums in the state, but those ones I'm acutely aware of. So uh, uh, definitely look them up, and if you're in the area, uh, reach out and see when their hours are. It's really wonderful to be able to visit and learn about the tribal history. Um, okay, do you collaborate with Native communities around the world? Um, so in my work, I haven't yet had the opportunity with, but it is important, and I wanted to mention that that there's a slight exception to that, and that's we did a workshop with the St. Regis Mohawk tribe in Akwesasne, and Akwesasne is both in the US and Canada. Their homelands are both, like, before there was even a border. Um, so when we think about international, part of exerting their tribal sovereignty was inviting their tribal citizens that were also from the Canada side to participate in that workshop. And so they're like, we're the first country this place. US and Canada came after, but this is who we want to be here. There have been tribal climate camps in the Pacific Northwest that have invited delegations from it was some years ago, I want to say 2017, but I think a delegation, if I'm not mistaken, was from Indonesia. And they had a few delegates come and participate in this camp. So I personally did not have the opportunity to attend that, but I was aware of it. So we do see a little bit of that there. But we always have to remember we have Indigenous nations, we're global and we're international. So there's the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So that's we can't always just think about within the United States, we need to think about globally as well. There's a question here, and I think I might have time for about two more, but let me go ahead and do this one. Does the Mashpee Wampanoag have active collaborations with national or regional Indigenous organizations that would be interesting to know about, such as ACES? And ACES is the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, and NACOB, North American Indian Center Boston. So I know with ACES, there has been like a discussion on having like a K through 12 chapter for Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe. And the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe throughout its history has had connections with NICOB, actually back in the 70s when it was the BIC, Boston Indian Council. So Mashpee and Aquinnah, they both have education departments, and both also have youth councils and advisors on those youth councils that work to connect students with opportunities such as ACES or others. And I'll just take these two more questions and then wrap up. But there's do you know if any climate adaptations relate to invasive species? Yes. I mentioned the tribal adaptation menu done, which began in Anishinaabe communities. They talk about invasive species in that, but they talk about it using different, not only their Anishinaabe language, but also a little. So they have a word for invasive species, and I forget the word in Anishinaabe, but it's translates to non-local being. And their approach is to look at it as like, when a quote invasive species is in a place or like in a tribal homelands, it itself is not inherently bad. The teaching is that it is following its instructions of creation from its homeland, but it's been taken from its homeland and planted or brought to a different homeland, and it doesn't have its natural predators. It doesn't have the things that are going to keep it in check. And so what tribes, when we look about the tribal adaptation menu, that what they look at is working with tribal nations to see what do we do about these non-local beings. Are they permanent, and how do we live with them? Are there do some need to be, and if they are removed, what's the impact on that? So there's a very interesting look at invasive species from a tribal perspective, and in that perspective, it's referred to as non-local beings. And this last question: are tribal nations represented at the COP meetings? So we do have representatives from tribal communities and tribal organizations that regularly attend the COP meetings, including good friends and colleagues of mine who have attended. I think it's important for tribal nations to attend those as well, since they are international and on the international stage. So I wish I had like knew more exactly like who in addition participated those. But what I can tell you is that yes, citizens and organizations from tribal communities and tribal organizations do routinely go to COP and attend and participate. Awesome. So I want to say Katapatanamu to everyone. And thank you very much for spending the evening. I hope everyone learned a lot. Again, it's a lot of information. We have to look at history. We have to look at culture when we talk about climate change from tribal perspectives. But again, thank you for this time. And it was an honor to be with everyone this evening. Katapatanamu to you all.
Dr. Thornbrugh, thank you so much for an informative presentation and sharing your knowledge with us this evening. And for everyone else, thank you for joining us. I was sending a recap with a link to the recording if you wanted to watch this again or share it with those who were not able to join us today. Thank you again, Dr. Thornbrugh.
Thank you again. Have a good evening, everyone. And I'll leave my contact. I think I'm able to share my contact information. Just Collective is our organization that my wife and I do to continue this adaptation and work and supporting communities. And this is my email where we can be reached. Katapatanamu, and good evening, everyone.
Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.